Well, Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Welcome to our service once again. We're grateful to the Lord that you are here with us to study His Word. Last week we talked about the decision-making process and how, as we break down how we make decisions, we realize that, number one, every decision that we make initially is an emotional one. No matter how logical we set ourselves up or claim ourselves to be, physiologically, the thoughts that come through our head, first of all, go through the limbic system, which is the central part of the brain, and then it's the cerebral cortex after. And that central part is where the emotions happen. The cerebral cortex is the analytical part, and so we always know that whatever decision that we make, whatever thought that we have, is always an emotional one first. So we cannot, number one, control the thoughts that go into our head. We cannot control the emotions that we experience, at least initially, although we can eventually train ourselves to respond differently emotionally. But the key is the response. We get an emotion, and the reason why most people have less than desirable circumstances in their life is because they don't respond emotionally in a positive way. They don't respond according to the way the scriptures tell us. And so what Paul is telling us here, that again, although this particular passage in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, where it says that we take every thought captive and bring it under the obedience of Messiah, that we are, this is against people who have false ideas about God. They come against the knowledge of God. Last week we saw I think the wonderful movie, God's Not Dead, and saw a whole debate between a student and a college professor about whether God is indeed dead or not. And so he was refuting these silly arguments, and that's really what they are. When you say that there is no God, you really put yourself out on thin ice, because I mean, if you look at it from a rational and analytical point of view, it doesn't make any sense. Evolution wasn't even a thought until Charles Darwin wrote the book Origin of the Species. And I can tell you right now, Charles Darwin was a high-ranking Freemason. Charles Darwin knew that there was a God. And so the theory of evolution was brought about not because those who espoused it, we discussed this in our message on the Illuminati, but they believe in God and they hate him. And so their idea is that because they worship Lucifer. And so what they've done is they've created this philosophy, that's really all that evolution is, to pull people away from God. Whatever means they can do it, whether it be false religion, whether it be New Age, whatever the case may be, their objective is just to pull people away from God. And so in Paul's statement here, we're coming against those lofty thoughts that are raised up against the knowledge of God. And where do these thoughts originate from? Lucifer himself. Isaiah chapter 14, starting in verse 11. It says, I will make myself like the Most High. So what he was doing was he was saying he was going to become God. He was going to replace God. So that's where these thoughts come from. However, in our own internal battles, and we have battles every day, those thoughts are raised up against the knowledge of God and his righteousness, because God is holy, God is righteous, God is good. And when we have sin that enters into our life, or sinful thoughts, we went through the whole sin process where in James chapter 1, it says the thought comes, then we entertain it, and then we act upon it. Once we act upon it and do the deed, that's when actually sin enters in, and then of course that's what brings death. So this here, we know that our thoughts are going to be emotional. So we might as well just get to dealing with that. How we respond to those emotional thoughts are really going to determine how our lives look. Some people are incredibly successful in their lives in many different areas because they apply success principles, even if they're not godly. If you look at a guy like Warren Buffett, Warren Buffett's one of the richest men in the world. Or another guy, Bill Gates. They usually go back and forth between the two of them as to who has the most wealth. Neither of them are believers. Neither of them worship the one true God. And yet, they are wildly wealthy. I mean, tens of billions of dollars, over $100 billion sometimes, depending on how the stock market does. How is it that they have been able to obtain that? Well, if you look at some of the things that Warren Buffett says, he says, invest in yourself. So Warren Buffett is constantly studying. He reads anywhere, I think, between 4 to 8 hours a day or something like that. Guy's got more money, he knows what to do with, but he's constantly learning, constantly applying success principles. The reason why we don't have success in our lives in certain areas is because we're not applying those success principles. Now, I think that some of these wealthy people, obviously, we wouldn't agree with where they are spiritually, but we certainly can admire and learn from what they've done here in other areas of their life. And so this knowledge of God that we have is that we need to come against those thoughts that deviate us from the righteousness of God and His Word. And one of the most important components of how our lives are going to look and how we are, what kind of results we're going to have, has to do with what we call self-talk. It's how we speak to ourselves. We've all heard or spoken about that little voice inside your head. Sometimes there are many, in which case then we have other problems. But that voice inside of our head is really our consciousness, or conscience. And the conscience, really, I believe, is the Holy Spirit speaking to us and saying, no, this is what God says. And we all know those times in our life where we have had this thought, or we've had this sense, and we've ignored it, and it hasn't gone well for us. And then we say, I should have listened to my gut. Now, it's not your gut itself, but that's where the feeling occurs. Anytime I listen to my gut, it's usually because it's rumbling because I've overfed it or something like that. But in this particular case, when we have that intuition, it seems like that's where the emotion manifests itself. And so if you're going to be doing something, and so, it's, obviously we have superheroes, and it's like our spidey sense is going off. It's like something just isn't on the kosher side over here. But if we ignore that, because of convenience or peer pressure, whatever it is, we end up with results that aren't pleasing to us. Proverbs chapter 23, verse 7 says, do not eat the bread of a selfish man, or desire his delicacies, for as he thinks within himself, so he is. He says to you, eat and drink, but his heart is not with you. You will vomit up the morsel you have eaten and waste your compliments. So the key to that is that, although you may be offered something from somebody who's selfish, as he thinks within himself, so he is. Whatever thoughts that we have define who we are. And that's why self-talk is so important. Because as we discussed last week, the subconscious mind is what powers how we feel about ourselves and what we think about ourselves, whether it be true or not. Subconscious mind being over 2 million times as big as the conscious mind, with the number of neurotransmitters that are working. In his tremendous book, What to Say When You Talk to Yourself, Dr. Chad Helmstetter, he says in chapter 6, all of us talk to ourselves all of the time. Our self-talk may be in spoken words or unspoken thoughts. It can take the form of feelings, impressions, or even wordless physical responses. The clutch in the stomach that comes when we are surprised or afraid, the rush that comes with excitement or joy. So there are many ways that those thoughts come to us. We are all thinking machines that never shut down. From childhood on, we have been watching, listening to, sifting, sorting, analyzing, judging, cataloging, and storing everything that goes on about us. You realize that every single stimuli that you have ever experienced is never forgotten. It is parked away in your brain. It's not in the conscious level, so we often forget. Some of us sometimes struggle, for instance, to remember names. And when you were introduced to someone, you know their name. You have that name. It's like when there's a sound that is made, it generates sound waves. And those waves go off into the universe, and they will remain there forever. Every single word that we've ever spoken is somewhere in the known universe. When someone introduces themselves to you and says, "Hi, my name is such and such," even if you haven't consciously been listening, that name is parked in there. The problem is it goes behind a door that we don't have the key to, and we can't remember it. And often that's because, you know why most people can't remember names? It's not paying attention. You're so focused on either how you're presenting yourself to them, or that you're trying to, you're looking at, her handbag or her shoes and evaluating that, or you're thinking about a conversation you had. You're not paying attention. And then you're thinking, "Oh, geez, what was that person's name again?" And there are techniques that we can develop, but the point is that name is buried somewhere in your brain. Most of the brain we don't have access to. It's been estimated that we use somewhere between 8 and 12% of our brains. The rest of it, I think most of that got shut down, of course, with the fall. I would suspect that Adam had 100% use of his brain. I'd like to have use of the 10% that apparently I do have active most of the time, because until I've had that second cup of coffee in the morning, most of my brain doesn't work at all. Some of you have had conversations with me at those times. But he goes on to say that most of our self-talk is unconscious. So that voice that's going on inside of your head is speaking to you, but you're not actually listening to the conversation. It's not like we have a little angel on one shoulder and a devil on another, and it's going back and forth. Most of the conversation that's going on inside of you is actually at the subconscious or unconscious level, which is where, as I said last week, I believe the Bible is calling the soul, the mind, will, and emotions. At times, our self-talk comes in feelings and can't quite be put into words. At other times, it comes in little flashes, flickers, and thoughts which never quite catch fire or glow bright enough to last long enough to become ideas, clearly thought out and understood. All of our thoughts, all of our pictures in our minds are always tied to something else that we already know about. And this is such a key point here. Every new thought that we have is associated with a known thought that you already have. Because when the brain absorbs new information, it has to be able to relate it to something. So even though, let's say you decide that you're going to go on a trip to a new place and you've never been there before, and you see something that you've never seen before. Let's say you go down to Arizona and you've never seen a canyon, and you see the Grand Canyon. This big, beautiful wonder of nature that was carved out by the flood of Noah, although evolutionists will tell you it took millions of years and stuff like that. The water burst forth and shifted all the ground and everything else. But you've never seen anything like that before. And yet when you see it, the first thing that your brain does is it's looking for something that it already has to identify with. Well, that's like such and such. And so that's how we make our associations, and that's how we absorb new things. We at least, identify with someone else. You'll always, if you meet someone new, you'll say, well, that person reminds me of such and such. There are characteristics that we have that will always bring us back to something known. So what the brain is always trying to do is to link new experiences to existing ones so that it can categorize it. And the problem that we run into is when it puts it in the wrong category. We discussed some of this last week, where if we have a negative experience with, let's say a girl was either abused when she was younger, or maybe went through a bad relationship, and then she has a false idea that all men are like that. And so the thought that will go into her brain when she meets someone new is that if he exhibits a certain characteristics, that characteristic might remind her of something in her past, and therefore the categorization she will make about that person will be bad. An example I have is that I have a friend of mine who years and years ago we had gone up to a cottage together with a bunch of friends, and we were driving up, and as we were on our way back, I was talking to her about something, and she said to me, "You're not the boss of me." Now, I wasn't trying to tell her what to do, but what she said to me is, she says, you remind me a lot of my father. Okay, and her father was, quite stern and verbally abusive. He was dismissive of her too, and emotionally cold. And so because I guess temperament-wise, and as we study the temperaments, we realize that everybody has one of 4 temperaments, then primary and secondary. So there's not really a whole lot of differentiation. There's 12 temperament combos that you can have. And so that if you have more than 12 people in a room, you will have 2 people guaranteed with the exact same temperament mix. So if I had the similar temperament makeup as her father, then even the way that I speak, because for instance, cholerics will quite often talk like each other, high D's, dominant people. We will, even though we've never met before, we will talk along the same lines in the same way. And so what that's going to do in someone is trigger that even though I may not be saying anything remotely, there's going to be an emotional response that she's going to have because of her father, and that's what caused the conflict that we were having. Our brains do this all the time. Every new piece of information that we have has to be categorized. And where we really get thrown for a loop is that we've got no category to attach it to. You can't identify it. Now, one of the problems that we run into is that the category we put it in may be a wrong category. We may think it is that because our brain says, well, it should be this, and we have an emotional response to it, but it may be nothing of the sort. And then, when we make that decisions based on that going forward, it could be totally wrong all the time because we've categorized it in the wrong place. Does that all make sense? This is more like a psychology lesson than a sermon message. But the point is that if we don't understand how our subconscious minds work, we're never going to figure out how to change our results and our circumstances in life. And the majority of problems that we as Christians have in this world is because we don't have that proper understanding of how our brains work. So studying things like psychology can be very helpful. We got to be careful that we don't get sucked into a lot of the philosophy behind psychology because, even psychology today, a lot of it is still influenced by Freud, who was I think a relative of Charles Darwin, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong there, but anyway, Freud had, another guy who was trying to pull people away from God. So anyway, the more we think a certain way, the deeper, so the longer we think in a particular fashion, and when it comes to self-talk, our self-talk can be very destructive. The more that we say those negative things to ourselves, the more we will believe that, and therefore the truer it will be. You understand what I'm saying? Truth either is or isn't. It's absolute. But it becomes more true to us. You'll hear something, you'll kind of go, I don't know about that. But if you keep hearing that same message over and over again, you will accept it as fact. And when it's negative self-talk, which Shad Helmstetter says that 75% of all self-talk is negative. You wouldn't believe some of the things. As a matter of fact, it's been said that if someone else came into your house and spoke to you the way that you speak to yourself most of the time, you'd kick them out. Oftentimes, the way that we speak to ourselves is like having someone come into your house with a can of stinky garbage and dumping that all over your floor. And then you smell that for the rest of the day. That's the way we speak to ourselves a lot of the times. I'll get into some examples in a little bit. So the more we think in a certain way, the deep, remember, when we repeat patterns, those neural pathways, those neurotransmitters with the synapses producing those electrical impulses, it follows along that same path. Well, if it keeps going along that same path, the groove in our brains get deeper and deeper, which means those habits get more and more ingrained. When we start undertaking a new skill, like my son, who just started sports camp this week, and he's trying swimming and soccer and all this stuff. My son is not an athlete, okay? He loves to run around and stuff like that, but unless he truly disciplines himself, I would say that he is not what we would call a natural talent. He's kind of gangly and a little, he's slower to pick up on physical things. That's just not how he's wired. But if he were to really get passionate about something and practice, I have a friend of mine who has his son in hockey, and He's got a very, mild temperament. He's highly phlegmatic, and yet this kid has been playing hockey for so many years that he's actually above many people his own age. He plays at a higher level than most because he's disciplined himself. And the reason is because he's practiced the same thing over and over and over again. You can all recall when you undertook some sort of sporting endeavor, whether it be playing basketball or soccer or hockey or, tiddlywinks or whatever it is that we did. It took us a long time, but the more we practiced it, the easier it got to do it, and the more it became ingrained as part of our nature. Our self-talk does the exact same thing. The more you say something to yourself, the more it becomes true, the more your mind accepts it, and if it needs to be changed, the harder it becomes to change that. We have to understand that. Some of us have had habits that we have been practicing for decades. And it's not good. But it becomes very difficult. That's where addictions come in. Because it creates a physiological response. We need whatever it is. Because with a lot of these addictions, there's a chemical there's a chemical response our body makes, and it floods our body with chemicals that our body desires. For anyone who has ever smoked, the first time you tried a cigarette, it was awful. But you kept doing it. And it got to the point where your body required the hit that the nicotine and all the other stuff, the tar and whatnot, provides for you. Same thing with, most people I know, when they first started drinking beer was an acquired taste. Beer is not something that, most people naturally enjoy. Pop, that's a lot of sugar in there. But, so the point is that the more we speak to ourselves in the same fashion, the harder that habit, if it's a bad habit, is going to be to break. And so, the longer we believe something, the truer that it is. The subconscious mind stores every thought and feeling we produce and reinforces how we think about ourselves. So here, where Paul says is that we got to take those thoughts captive. If you're saying something to yourself that's negative, then we have to stop that. We got to become conscious of it. Many times we have a battle between the conscious and subconscious mind. So, for instance, if let's say you want to start a new business, and so you've got this great idea. And by the way, ideas are a dime a dozen. Everybody's got great ideas. Where the successful people come in is that they come up with a game plan to implement that idea and then work relentlessly to bring that idea to fruition. There has rarely been a great idea that has come by fluke. It usually requires hard work and much, much sacrifice. And so much of our culture today is all about the instantaneous results that we get, and things are, we come up with this great idea, build a better mousetrap and they will come. No. Anybody who's ever had a great idea, so for instance, with where God is taking you and shifting you to a more messianic style of worship, it's a great idea. How do we know that? Because the scriptures say so. However, when we present that to our fellow brothers and sisters, the response that we get isn't necessarily a positive one. As soon as you come up with a good idea and you tell people you're going to pursue it, the response that you're more than likely going to get is that you're crazy, you can't do it, why would you bother? And it goes on and on and on. That's the way we speak to ourselves too. So you might be wanting to start a new business, but then all those thoughts come from how we have failed in the past. Do you know Thomas Edison failed at creating the light bulb over 1,000 times before he finally came up with the successful model? But if you had asked him whether he had failed 1,000 times, he says, no, I just learned 1,000 ways not to build a light bulb. But it's all framing. It's all how we perceive things. You are not going to be successful in life until you've had failure. People who haven't struggled, people, the trust fund kids and stuff like that, most of their lives are total train wrecks when they get older. Why? Because they've never had to struggle. I just mentioned to you that my wife and I just celebrated our 9th anniversary. And one of the reasons why we can stand here and give a testimony that our marriage is good, because we've struggled. There have been some tough times. As a matter of fact, I had someone say to me, if you haven't even contemplated separation or divorce, then you really haven't, lived a marriage. If that thought hasn't gone through your head that I'm going to send this person back from whence they came, then you really haven't lived a marriage. Your marriage hasn't really been tested. So nothing comes that's worthwhile without struggle. But how we can change that struggle from an internal perspective, you're going to experience external resistance to whatever it is you're going to try to do. Doesn't matter what it is. Orrin Woodward calls a goal planned conflict against the status quo. It's conflict and it's planned against those who would have us continue to live in mediocrity. As soon as you try to step above that, you're going to meet resistance. So you're going to get external resistance. But when you are fighting against yourself and your subconscious mind is reminding you of the 1,000 times where you created the light bulb and it didn't work, that's where we get discouraged. And although your breakthrough might be right around the corner, we give up because we think, and this is where Christians come in and say, oh, I guess God doesn't want me to do this because this is hard. Where on earth have you ever read in here that the Christian life, the walk with God, is supposed to be easy? And we bought into this nonsensical narrative from mainstream churchianity today to say that, well, if God wants it to be, then he's just going to provide a big easy button that we can hit and boom, it's all going to happen. Show me the verse where it says that. And yet we're so quick to give up on our goals and dreams. We're so quick to give up on, what we're doing because we run into a little resistance. Was it hard to lose the weight? It was a struggle, wasn't it? You had a lot of habits that you had built up over the years that you needed to break. And there was a lot of temptation that came your way, didn't it? There still is. But because you have told yourself, no. Now, had you tried to lose weight before?
A long time ago. I would put back on again. This time I learned that I have to change my lifestyle.
Do you know 95% of people who lose like 100 pounds or more put it back on again? Almost all of it. I had someone in my family who did that. Lost 110 pounds, almost all of it's back now. Heartbreaking. But the reason is because they deviate from the things that brought them success to begin with. They go through the hard work, they manage to change their habits, but only temporarily to achieve the results, and then they go back to right where they were before in the bad habits, because those habits are hard to break because they're ingrained. It takes a long time. The longer you have had those habits, the more you have reinforced them, the harder they are to break. It's so important what we say to our minds. You may be trying to do something and then you say, well, I failed at this before. Shut up. I am not listening to you. Literally, sometimes we have to do that. Because the thought might come internally, but the thought also might come from a spiritual force that wants you to fail. Okay, so we're going to get both. This is also why it's so incredibly important what we say to our kids. Because our kids are forming their identity based on what we, primarily as parents, tell them. I've said this before, but they did a study of a whole bunch of men in prison. They asked them, how many of your fathers blessed you growing up? Now, one of them said yes. Then they said, how many of your fathers cursed you when you grew up? Almost every one of them said so. Well, they were just living out. When you say to your kids, you're stupid, they're going to believe that. And then they're not going to do well at school if you can't figure why they don't do their homework. On average, we hear no 30 times as much as we hear yes or you can growing up. By the time we're 18 years old, the ratio is about 30 to 1. I see it with my son all the time. No, you can't. Now, sometimes you have to say no, because they're usually getting into things that they're not supposed to get into. No, 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 no. But how we phrase it, and my wife is very gifted at this. She's always very conscious because of her teacher training, that she says that you can't tell them, you don't criticize their character. What you do is you target their behavior. So instead of saying something like, that was stupid, or you're stupid, or you're being bad, you can say that was a bad decision. So what we always do with my son is we try to frame it and talk about the act that he's done, not the fact that he is that way. Because if we tell him something negative, his subconscious mind is going to store that, and he's going to believe it. I told a story about this last week, that we had one fella in this leadership business that I work with, and he was told as a youngster that he had a bad smile, he had bad teeth or something like that. He didn't smile for 30 years after that. Still managed to get married and have kids, I'm not sure how. But for 30 years he didn't smile until he got into this leadership business. And so he was asked by his mentor, he said, "Can you smile?" And he said, "Yeah, of course I can smile." He said, "Will you?" And it was so hard for him, he had to actually practice in the mirror. Because that one comment set him on a path. We got to be so careful about what we tell others and what we tell ourselves. If we tell kids things like, "You can't do that," or "You'll never amount to anything," or "You're just like your father," how many of you got one of those? We destroy their self-image. So Helmstetter says there are 5 levels of self-management. Number 1 is behavior. It's the stuff we do. It's very obvious. There's the practices that we have. Okay? Number 2 are the feelings. And our feelings, remember, are triggered by chemical responses. We don't control what the feelings are, at least initially. You can begin to reverse that, to change that. No. After feelings, at the deeper level, are attitudes, because our attitudes are what usually produce our feelings. Number 4 are our beliefs, because our beliefs are what determine our attitudes. And where all of this stems from, number 5, is the programming that we got. Whether through what you've allowed into your life or what someone else has imposed upon your life. So our programming determines our beliefs. Our beliefs determine our attitudes. Our attitudes will determine our feelings. And our feelings will determine our behavior. Paul gives a similar analogy of this, or example, in Romans chapter 5, where he tells us that we also glory in tribulations, knowing that tribulation produces perseverance, perseverance, character, and character, hope. So there's a whole chain of events that we have that produce the results that we have in our life. And in the decision-making process, we have to go back and determine what those things are. So behavior, feelings, attitudes, beliefs, and programming. I'm not going to get into a whole lot of detail about this. We may touch upon this a little more next week. But there are 4 levels of self-talk that Helmstetter identifies. He has a 5th one, which we won't discuss today. But the first level of self-talk is negative acceptance. When we say to ourselves, "I can't do that. I don't do that. I'm lousy at remembering names." How many of you have said that? Every time you say that, you reinforce that attitude in your mind. Because your subconscious mind says, "Oh, okay, well, try me at remembering names. I guess we're not going to remember names." Because in order for us to remember names, we have to change what we do in order to remember a name. So maybe you got to repeat it over in your mind a couple of times. But if you just say to yourself, I can't do that, you won't bother making the changes necessary to change the results. Okay? Negative acceptance is the most common level and the most destructive, because it's all self-defeating. Number 2 is level of recognition and need to change. This one's a sneaky one. Why? Because we tell ourselves, Number 2 is level of recognition and need to change. So, I should do this. I should clean the house. I should exercise. I need to start preparing cooking earlier. I need to speak more kindly to my spouse. I need to get to work on time. What are we doing? We're identifying the fact that we need to change. However, what we're really doing is we're tricking ourselves because we think that it's helping when it's not. All we're doing is reinforcing and say, you don't have, when you say that I need to do something, what you're number one doing is acknowledging that you don't do something well, but you haven't gone beyond that. Because how many of you said, I need to exercise more? How many of you have exercised more once you said that? You don't. The reason is, all you've done is identified the problem. And in the 12-step pattern at Alcoholics Anonymous, that's only step 1. Admit there's a problem. Okay, you admit that you're a problem. You don't eat well. Okay, fine. You acknowledge that, but you haven't gone beyond that. Number 3 is the decision to change. Present tense and specific. So you start making comments to yourself like, I no longer smoke. Even when you're lighting up. You tell yourself, as you're lighting up, I no longer smoke. What Helmstetter says is at some point in time, your subconscious mind says, okay, no, what are you doing? If you no longer smoke, that's what you've been telling me over and over again. Why are you doing that? It's going to create cognitive dissonance, and at some point in time, your subconscious mind is going and saying, that's not true. What you're doing. You are acting counter to who you are. You say, I'm not a smoker. Or I exercise every day. I eat healthy. So they're positive affirmation statements. The things that you do. And then level number 4 is I am statements. I'm not a smoker. There's a difference between the two. One says, I don't smoke, and the other says, I'm not a smoker. Or I am a non-smoker. When you get to the I am statements, they're very, very powerful, but they have to repeat it over and over and over, because you all have I am statements that you use all the time. I am lousy at this. That I was stupid for doing this. You know how many times that we've called ourselves names? You wouldn't allow someone else to do that to you, but yet we do it to ourselves all the time. That was really a dumb thing to do. And then your spouse will usually affirm that. Or maybe that's just me, I don't know. Then you say, well, you didn't have to agree that quickly. So if we can change that messaging internally, it's going to make a massive difference in our lives and the results that we get. It may take time. You may spend years telling yourself that you are not something, you don't do something, and you're still doing it, until at one point in time, you just keep going until the subconscious mind takes over and says, okay, enough of this. You're lying to yourself. Stop. And the desire will be taken away. Helmstetter said that, and he talks about some techniques, a wonderful book. And if anybody wants to order a copy, we'll see how many and maybe order a bunch for the congregation. But he says that he decided that he needed to lose some weight. And so what he did is he created a tape for himself where he just played the recording every morning over and over and over. Whether it was conscious or when he was shaving or something like that, and he would play it every morning. Well, he says he lost 50 pounds But the fascinating thing was, because he meant, all these positive affirmation statements, and I'm losing weight and I eat healthy and all this other stuff. He says not only did he lose 50 pounds, but his wife, who wasn't even part of the program, lost 25 herself. Just by association, where she was getting the subconscious, because we have two types of listening. We have active listening, where I'm assuming most of you are doing that for me right now. There's nobody sleeping, is there? I do that in churches sometimes. I'll see who's not paying attention, and I'll walk right up to them, and they'll become my sermon illustration. Some churches like it, others churches don't. Depends on the culture.
Yeah.
Sometimes I strike fear into the hearts of people when I come to the church. You can ask me. Just remember, when I'm there, the back is not safe. Where was I going with that?
Two types of listening, active listening.
Oh yeah, so there's. Thank you. That's why we men get married. Dress us in the morning and help us to remember where the heck we were. But there's active listening, which is you're paying attention to what you're doing and to what you're hearing and maybe taking notes. But the passive listening, remember, your subconscious mind, 2 million times as big as your conscious mind. So your subconscious mind is going to absorb stuff that you're hearing. My sister, for instance, growing up, used to fall asleep at night with the TV on and used to watch the worst programs. Like the trash things that they put on back in the 90s and some, just horrendous messaging, and she would fall asleep to that every night. You can imagine the result that had on her, disposition, her attitude. So if you are playing stuff in the background, you could be playing a CD or an MP3 or something like that of positive affirming statements, something that you've recorded yourself or something that someone else has recorded. And you could be listening to it in the background, and even though you haven't actively been listening to it, all of a sudden it's going to pop up in your head one day because you just kept reinforcing that message over and over. Do not underestimate the power of the brain to absorb what's going on around it. But we don't pay attention to that, we don't take control of that, and therefore we are not utilizing the most powerful weapon that we have. If we want to take every thought captive, we have to start talking to ourselves differently. You have to start shutting down the message. Why are people so much in debt today? Because they're watching, the average American male watches 4 hours of TV every night. And in that 4 hours, you're going to get about an hour and a half of commercials. And what those commercials are designed to do is to program your subconscious mind to want what it is they're selling, whether you need it or not. And most time it's not. I mean, seriously. We are in such a consumer-driven society. I need that. Most of the stuff you have, you don't need. I got to go down to Toronto this next couple of days to unload a whole container of stuff that most of it I probably don't even need. But it's there, and I got to go get it. And then we got to figure out, my wife, yes, we're going to purge some of the stuff and get rid of it. The point is that we're being conditioned because we're allowing messaging to get in there. And so if you're struggling in a particular area, if you don't have success in a particular area in your life, if your walk with God isn't all that it ought to be, what we have to do, beloved, is look at the programming that we have subjected ourselves to and opened ourselves up to for sometimes decades, and begin to change that messaging. We take those thoughts captive, but first of all, we got to figure out where the message is coming from. We got to change that. Some of you need to turn off your TV. Most of you need to turn off your TV. Like, what good is TV doing? There are a couple of good renovation shows. My wife likes that. But the reason why she watches Home and Garden, because she's looking for ideas of what we're going to do for our home. She wants to be inspired. Inspiring things are wonderful. But watching things like, I don't know, Big Brother, Survivor, reality TV, ain't reality. Our programming, our self-talk, is the most powerful thing that we have. And if we take control of that message and we begin to change, and I would encourage all of you to speak to me after if you want to get this, and we'll order a bunch of copies. Go through this book, highlight it, start putting it into practice. I did that. I actually recorded an I am statement. But all the things that I said that I was doing, some of them I haven't accomplished yet. But as I continue to listen to it, I'm trusting that based on what science has told us and the way God has told us, as a man thinketh, so he is. What you think about yourself is your reality, whether or not it was what God intended. God didn't intend for any of us to be poor. God didn't intend for any of us to be failures. God didn't intend any of us to suffer the things that we suffer, and yet most of us have brought it upon ourselves because of the way that we think. When we take our thoughts captive, when we start controlling the message that's going in, when we start controlling the message that we give ourselves, and we start speaking truth and success into our relationships, into our finances, into our work ethic, and breaking those habits and those strongholds, we're going to see a miraculous transformation starting with individuals, communities, and eventually in society itself. Amen?
Amen.
Father, we do thank you and give you praise that this message is so powerful, Father, that we can control how we are perceived by ourselves, because we want, Lord, the message to be about how you see us, and that you loved us so much that you died for us, that you gave yourself for us. So help us, Father, to change that messaging. Those areas in our lives, Father, which aren't producing the results that we want, we pray that you would help us to identify the messaging that we're getting that's causing us to continue to struggle and continue to fail. And then in that, Father, I pray that we would get the right message, the right information, and we would see us being conformed to the image of Yeshua, who was the author and perfecter of our faith. In his holy name we pray.